Thank you for joining me for my winter lecture. I always try to do something seasonal at this time of the year, and you can find some of my previous talks on my YouTube site. I did one on how we got Santa Claus, thanks to a chap called Nast, an American cartoon who may have given us the term nasty because his cartoons were so vicious. And there's also one about Christmas traditions. But I thought this year we would go for the theme of Winter Wonderlands. That's also because I've always been particularly attracted to snowy scenes, not necessarily living through them, but certainly seeing them in paint. So I'm also hoping to take you on a sort of journey, a sort of en plein air journey from the naturalism and impressionism of the 1870s, right the way through symbolism at the turn of the century to the image that we have on the right-hand side, which is by one of the group of seven, one of the Canadian artists. And this image from the Arctic, which dates to the 1930s, could well be described as Art Deco, as it has, as you can see, a very strong graphic character. So a broad sweep, a broad brush even, in terms of the evolution of 19th and early 20th century art. But we are going to start, of course, with the Revolution, otherwise known as en plein air. And my image on the left-hand side, we'll hear more about him later, is Gerhard Munther, who is one of the Norwegian en plein air specialists. But I want to remind you, firstly, that it was the revolution, total revolution in painting, made possible by pre-mixed paints in collapsible metal tubes, which meant that artists could now travel very easily, take up their easel and their umbrella to keep shade, head off to their favourite spot and paint directly from nature outdoors. Whether you were doing this in midsummer, that's Troya on the beach at Skien in 1882, having to put up with sand and sun, and also some very irritating people looking over his shoulder. So that's part of the Skien group. So that's representing difficulty of painting in midsummer. But my other two images are much more appropriate. They are, of course, of winter. So we have top right, Carl Larsson, best known for his illustrated books on his family life in Sweden. As you can see, he's also being irritated by the local villagers. And I want you to particularly note that he's got his feet in straw boots, hopefully, I think probably a vain attempt to keep them warm. And that theme is picked up by my painting by Andersen Ring. There were so many Andersens, S-E-N, in Denmark, that the artist frequently had to take another name, usually their place of birth. So it's Ring, R-I-N-G, but you don't pronounce the G in Danish. So he's Andersen Ring. And he's also, as you can see, having a chat with one of the local villagers. My black and white photograph, however, shows Harald Solberg attempting to paint in the far north of Norway. And not only is he up a tree, literally, to get a bird's eye view, but I understand he had another problem, which was the bears. In other words, painting directly from nature out of doors was not without its problems. And here is perhaps the most famous en plein air painter of all, Monet here, depicted by John Singer Sargent, painting on the edge of a wood. This is now in the Tate collection. Dates to 1885, so he has settled at Giverny. He settles there in 1883 and will live out his life there until he dies in 1926. The young lady in the white in the background, one of the so-called Hoshaday girls. These were his stepdaughters, thanks to him sort of, I won't say shacking up, that sounds rather rude, but his decision to live with Alice Hoshaday, who he will not marry until the early 1890s, as they have to wait for Ernst Hoshaday to die. But in effect, it becomes a very complicated extended family with Monet's 2 children and the Hoshaday children, of which there are 6. That's likely to be Blanche or Suzanne Hoshaday. Monet was particularly keen on painting snow, and in fact there are over 120 canvases by Monet on the theme. He was probably attracted to the concept of painting snow as it is so difficult, not only to get the texture of the snow, but also the brilliant white light, as you can see here. It's one of his earliest attempts. It's simply known as the Magpie, and you'll find it in the Musée d'Orsay. The late 1860s were quite difficult for Monet. He had formed a liaison with Camille Danseur, but his family did not approve of this at all. And Camille will give birth to their first son, Jean, and thanks to help from a generous patron, Guibert, Monet is able to rent a house in Étretat, a famous seaside resort on the Normandy coast, which will actually attract a lot of impressionists and naturalist painters. So this was a rather a happy settled period in his life. It won't last for long, of course, because the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71 is on the horizon. This image is also said to be one of the very first in which Monet attempted to paint coloured shadows. The tradition had always been simply to paint them black, but you can see here he's trying to capture the reflective qualities and the refractive qualities of sunlight on snow, and the shadows pick that up and become purpley grey tonality to again reflect what you would actually see in nature. Remember that with French Impressionism, it's not really what you paint, but how you paint it. They're just really trying to explore the impact or the effect of light on objects. And he's going to paint very similar scenes, different times of the day, different weather patterns, again, because he's really interested in capturing the essence of light and shadow. So the subject matter itself is of secondary importance. But most importantly, of course, these all look like they've been painted very quickly out of doors to create that important concept of an impression. After the Franco-Prussian War, very hard up for money, Monet settles at Argenteuil, which is a suburb outside Paris. There were 18 paintings of Argenteuil under a blanket of snow created during the harsh winter of 1874 to 75. This one is the largest canvas, and you can find it in the National Gallery. Geographically, we're on the Boulevard Saint-Denis, looking towards the junction with the Rue de la Voie de Bas, and the River Seine is out of sight to the rear. This is just to emphasize the desire again to fix a location, but by high art standards, a very prosaic one, a very ordinary street. The effect, of course, is to try and capture the brooding winter sky, the snow on the branches of the trees, and the broken, as you can see, snow on the ground. So he's using a technique known as taches, little tiny flicks of paint to try and get that effect of flickering light. This is from the same campaign, this harsh winter of 1874, but here he's actually capturing the effect of snow itself falling. Very atmospheric image. The branches in the background delineated in a very simplistic but very effective manner. Like so many French Impressionist paintings, stand too close and it will dissolve into brushstrokes. It'll only become a meaningful image when you stand back. One of my favourite paintings by Monet are ice cubes of floating ice near Verteuil, which was the next suburb that they moved to. They were moving, the family was moving increasingly away from Paris in search of, let's face it, cheaper accommodation. And again, life at Verteuil was not without its problems. But Monet again produced some of his most famous canvases. This one is in the Musée d'Orsay, and again he was capturing a particularly harsh winter, 1879 to 80 in this case, when the Seine actually froze over, hence the title Ice Cubes. I love the way the light of dawn is catching on the foliage to either side. It's now got pink, and the sort of effect of pink in the sky, which is then, as you can see, bouncing off the ice cubes floating in the water. And he was already thinking along the idea of series. So you can see here we've moved into the 1880s and his technique is changing. The brushstrokes become broader and longer, not the little flicks, the tashes of the early 1870s. Here, of course, the thaw has set in, and you can see it's a very similar view, but slightly different, as you have the escarpment on the right-hand side, the valley in which of the Seine in which Vetheuil sits. But already he's exploring this idea of depicting the same location at different times of the day and in different weather conditions. The road to Giverny is obviously reflecting the fact that he has now found his ideal location. So he'll settle here with his family, extended family, remember. 2 of his own children, Camille has now died, and the Hocharday brood. And this is a very descriptive, painted very quickly, but a very naturalistic image of the road entering the village. There's a rather beautiful stylized tree on the left-hand side. A lot of trees in these paintings, as you're going to notice, take on a rather anthropomorphic character. It's certainly here a very dominant motif. Also notice the ruts in the road, and again how he has tried to bring in the coloured shadows, the sort of way the ruts in the road are painted grains in different tones, so greys, blues and purples, to get that effect of broken snow. They seem to be fascinated by smooth snow, untrammeled by any human, and equally fascinated by the broken snow that you see here. Or here, in fact, Frost at Giverny, if you took away those 2 figures on the left-hand side, would become much more abstract. Same dates. You can see here what I mean about his changing technical style, broader brushstrokes, sometimes leaving the canvas showing, the wonderful way that he has painted the foliage, the bushes here, with thick impasto. He was very much developing a much thicker palette from the mid-1880s onwards. This technique is very much associated with Vincent van Gogh, who will, of course, die in 1890. And then after his premature death, Van Gogh's paintings become very well known through exhibition. It has an almost abstract quality to it, this painting. If you were to remove those 2 human figures, I think that abstract quality would come over even more. And perhaps that's even more true of Haystacks, Snow Effect, one of his series. These paintings are said to have revolutionized the art of Kandinsky, who, as I was saying earlier, when you stand too close to them, Kandinsky claims you couldn't make out what was actually painted at all. It was only when he stood back that the shapes, the colours and the forms became legible. But there was no doubt in Kandinsky's mind that it was this idea, again, of privileging colour over form that was to revolutionise his own practice as an artist. Here in Haystacks, Snow Effect, you can see what I mean about coloured shadows. So there's just a flurry of snow on the top of the haystack. The paint is much more rough and sort of applied in a more, well, almost like, I wouldn't say angry, but you can see that there's a impasto element to it. So, but he's not trying to achieve perhaps the same same effect that he was back in the 1870s. It seems to be more about the spirit, or the idea of imbuing your image with some sort of poetic feel. So the idea was that the series would form like a symphony, and the idea was that when you went to visit the haystacks when they were hung in the gallery of Durand Ruel, that they would form like a musical notation. So each canvas would be like a note within a symphony. So rather a different goal than to his earlier work, which was just about creating a spontaneous image. These are much more measured, much more to do with the theme of making a correlation between the visual image and musicality. Monet was so keen on snow that he actually took himself off to Norway in 1895. 29 landscapes will come from this 2-month sojourn. He was largely visiting or stayed at Sandvika, and this is a village in the snow. And he was often attracted to a man-made object. And in this case, it's the bridge that you're seeing in the foreground, which was made out of iron, which at that time in Norway was in fact something of a novelty. Norway was very poor in the late 19th century and was late to industrialize. But this bridge, this iron bridge, undoubtedly sparked Monet's imagination. Here you can see a rather grey day, the dark sky, it's rather brooding, but look how he paints it in this one. It's quite different, white out almost, and I love the pinks and purples fluttering through the tree on the right-hand side. And it really does make you feel cold, doesn't it? But at the same time, it has a luminous quality. So here's a good example of choosing the same motif, but painting it under different lighting conditions. You don't really think of Monet painting mountains, but that's another thing that attracted him about going to the far north. He painted, of course, in Venice, south of France, and frequently could be found along the Normandy shores. But there was nothing quite as dramatic as the mountains. So here he is. Well, I hope I get it almost right. Gustaf Fjaestad, which is the mountain that you're looking at. Again, not that far from the village that we're looking at here, Sandvika, all in the same locale. And this was also from the same Norwegian campaign, these two really isolated cottages. Again, you can hardly differentiate between earth and sky. They have merged. Perhaps the only thing that indicates the difference is the more impasto application of the paint to represent earth, the smoothness of the sky, which is tinted a little pink, sort of reflected colour. But that allows me to make the quantum leap to Norway itself and the emergence of a Norwegian school of painters. We have a theme that we can track here at the end of the 19th century. Wherever you travel across Europe, artists are asserting their national identity. Every country wants to have their own national school that represents the uniqueness of their country. It doesn't matter whether you're in Sweden, Norway here, Finland or Denmark. They all want to assert their individuality. Many of them will go to learn their craft in Paris and will then return to their homeland, often permanently, sometimes on a more erratic basis. Some artists settled in France, but constantly travel back to their homeland during the summer months. This is Fritz Thalau, and representing here winter 1884. It's really like my previous little cottages, emphasizing how difficult it must have been to exist through a Norwegian winter with those really dark nights above the Arctic Circle. The whole of December is dark, and obviously the weather conditions themselves. And the only way to get around was by skis. So you can see skis in the foreground. There's some footsteps, but there's some very obvious ski tracks. If you look into the background, you can see a lad on skis making his way across this rather formidable landscape. Fritz Thalau has always intrigued me, as he's one of what I think of as the big three. Three artists, again, committed to naturalism, painting en plein air, and were very part of the bohemian life of Christiania, which was the original name of Oslo. Of course, Norway doesn't get independence from Sweden until 1905. So here's another factor, again, because they feel oppressed by another country, in this case, Sweden. Norway wants to assert its individuality through its art and broader culture, language. Henrik Ibsen being a good example. He actually wrote in Danish, by the way. So here we have Fritz Thalau looking, again, rather chilly in a gigantic fur coat, painting en plein air. You can see that sometimes one of the challenges was the size of the canvases that they chose to work on. Anyway, Thalau was very much part of this bohemian circle that numbered Christian Kroger and Erik Werenskjold, who, by the way, will be very famous for painting portraits of the great and the good, including Ibsen. This is the street in Craigero, 1882, and again we've got a rather jolly scene because we've got the lads tobogganing down the main street. This is really what we refer to as 19th century naturalism. The subject here is still very important, and a lot of artists respond to the concept again that living in the countryside was healthier and it was more natural. You were closer to nature and therefore closer to God. So there was this whole idea really of encouraging this idea of communal life in the countryside. You can contrast that immediately with Christian Kroger's struggle for survival, which was the flip side of living in the city. Harsh, none of your familial ties. You can notice here all these women and children crowding round for a loaf of bread. The implications are that they are fighting for survival as they have no men to lean on. Christian Kroger himself was very politically active. We see him here painted by Fritz Tallau on the main streets in Oslo. There's a rather jolly band in the background, but Kroger himself was politically very active. He wrote socialist novels. He was like Henrik Ibsen, wanted to condemn the hypocrisy of late 19th century bourgeois life in Norway. He was also very keen on exposing the sort of inequalities of life. So several of his social realist novels deal with the thorny issue of prostitution. So Christian Kroger here showing you the struggle for life in the city. That's a nicer subject. This is Erik Werenskiold, and we're as late as 1909 here to remind you that the sort of whole en plein air revolution is, well, a very sort of long gestation period. It took artists quite a long time to renounce the academic Finnish and to embrace the whole idea of en plein air painting directly from nature. I love this image because again, it's that thick, creamy application of paint. You can just about make out the differentiation between the water, which is the grey, and a thicker brush strokes to indicate it, the little boats floating on top, and there's this whole challenge of painting white on white. This is, I think, very much in that sort of rapid, impressionistic, spontaneous style, as is this one, though this is much earlier, from 1889, White Frost, where you get these wonderful purples. And again, really the motif here is secondary to the effect of light on the trees in the background. If you removed that house on the right-hand side, it would in fact acquire a much more abstract character. Fritz Tallau here, showing you again how difficult it is to exist in the far north during the winter months. We're on the river Simoa, 1883. This is one of the most famous images in the National Gallery collection in Oslo. Our woman is rowing across the river. You can see it's semi-frozen in the background, but fast flowing in the foreground. And she's rowing towards that little group of Norwegian houses in the background, distinctly painted red, with that rather comforting plume of smoke coming out of the chimney. You're not going to be able to nip across this river for a loaf of bread and a pint of milk. It's again reminding you that you need stamina and fortitude to live through these grueling winters. And Tallau becomes very interested in the theme of the moving water. Winter landscape or thawing ice. There's a whole series of this motif, mostly painted in pastel. This is the first of the group, 1887. We know it was painted on a farm just outside Oslo, Grini, where the artist was living. He's going to actually, in the end, succumb to the desire for slightly better weather. He'll move to France permanently in 1892, but like so many artists, will return to his homeland during the summer months. What I really like about this painting is not just the way that he's captured the fast flowing water. We can imagine the thaw might just be setting in, but how he has again produced this pattern, the sort of outline of the shore has become a curvy linear S-line pattern. And this is the theme that he traces through this sequence of paintings. This one is from the 1890s. So again, there's at least 11 versions of this motif. Again, emphasizing how artists find a particular motif that takes their imagination. And here, undoubtedly, again, it's the flowing water, the static snow and the flowing water and the bright light, as you can see, illuminating the foliage in the background. Which brings us to the image by Gerhard Munter that I showed you right at the beginning, because again, it's very similar. This interest in flowing water and static snow, and here dated to 1890, you get a real feel for what I refer to as naturalism. Again, this idea of painting quickly out of doors to create a spontaneous image. Munter's always fascinated me because he was very influenced by William Morris. He will turn to the decorative arts and also become a very important printmaker. He will illustrate many, I won't call them children's books, but books that reflect the interest in Norwegian folklore and folk art. This is the interior of his own studio house, Leveld. And this is the living room. I love the fireplace. There's a lot of painted decorations you can see here. He designed textiles, wall hangings, particularly carpets. You can see there's one, a rug on the floor. Look at all the prints on the wall. These again reflect the printed books that he has been working on. And he was very much part of this Christiana bohemian life. He's painted here by Christian Kroger in the mid-1880s. Looking rather ravish in a fur-collared coat, smoking a cigarette. He was very much part of that Oslo Christiana bohemian avant-garde. The doctor here, obviously, making his way through the wintry landscape. Perhaps we are looking at a doctor who is on his way to deliver a new baby. You can make up any narrative that you like. But the theme again is emphasizing the difficulties of living through these harsh winter months. It's a very ordinary subject, again, which challenged academic perceptions. They're always looking in the academy for ennobling subjects. And this is very down to earth. The doctor, hopefully, there to deliver a baby. And the same could be said true here of Throwing Snowballs of 1885. It's a much more commercial image. You can imagine your bourgeois family wanting this sort of image of, well, I won't say togetherness as they're fighting each other, but it is a very descriptive image of the children playing in the snow. Again, 1885 in date, when naturalism was at its height. This was partly the influence of the French artist Bastien Lepage, who settled in a small French village, Domvilliers, in the duchy of Lorraine, to paint village life as authentically as possible. You can see what I mean here about what I refer to as late 19th century naturalism. And that idea of finding an ideal village way of life, something that the artist felt could be authentically depicted, was also pursued by Laurits Andersen Ring. So he takes ring, or ring, because remember you have to drop the G, to differentiate himself from the many other Danish Andersens, as in Hans Christian Andersen. Here he is, the painter in the village of 1897. He's actually born in southern Zealand, which is the largest of the Danish islands and is where you will find the capital, Copenhagen. But here we are in a very isolated spot, and this conversation between him and the villager again allows you to think about what they thought about each other. So remembering Monet did not find it easy in the village of Giverny. Many of the villagers felt that he was very much an outsider. He represented urban life. He came with a brood of children and a wife who he was not actually married to. And so you can imagine there was a certain amount of antipathy between the incomers and the villagers. So this assumption that they would find some sort of utopia in these villages was often challenged, as the villagers resented them coming in. Frequently they would pay higher rents, and they would bring what many felt were bad city habits with them. Anyway, here is Rin, and he will stay in this village, Baldersbrønde, hope I've pronounced that right, in Zealand. He will live here from 1901 until 1913. Once an artist finds an ideal spot, like the Glasgow Boys in Kirkcudbright and Brigham Turk, or if we look to places in France like Pont-Aven, or my favourite artist colony at Grey-Stillois, then a lot of artists tend to follow suit and come and paint alongside each other, forming a sort of artistic commune. In the case of Andersen Ring, he seems to be quite isolated, living here 1901 to 1913, but I would like to emphasise that he was very happily married and will have 3 children. So we've got this rather, again, cold, isolated image of the streets, the very strong angle, the diagonal of the road and the trees immediately makes one think of a Japanese print. It's not disturbed by any human activity, and again you've got that contrast between the broken snow and the smooth snow. I particularly like the sentinels of the trees. But on the other image, also painted in the same village, it's entitled Bad Weather, you can see again this idea of existing in the far north, because the postman has just trudged through the snow. You can see his footsteps, he's left them behind, and he appears to have delivered a newspaper as well as some letters to our character here, who is standing in the doorway and probably very happy not to have to put up with the harsh conditions. It's a really good image, and Rin was very good at this idea of, again, putting a figure on the threshold, so inside looking out. This is quite different, however. By 1912, he's moved into a more symbolist mode. The rather sombre image of the rook, always a harbinger of usually ill luck, the smooth blue snow and the broken road in the centre, but the image is really dominated by the rune stone, and we're at Roskilde, again famous for its Viking longships. The famous museum is there, but here we have the rune stone looking back to the Viking pagan heritage. Perhaps the message was the longevity of occupation of the land. You're looking back to a pagan primitive past. It looks rather like a tombstone as well. Perhaps that's again linking through to that rook as a harbinger. So it's that idea of winter representing death, but out of death there will be life, because by this stage Rin has definitely entered the world of symbolism. And that is also very true of his friend Wilhelm Hammershøi, who is not well known for landscapes at all, but is best known for his interiors, a series of paintings representing rooms and doors and windows. White doors or open doors here of 1905. The idea is, as you go through these doors, you're passing over different thresholds in life. Hammershøi lived and painted these images in Stangard in the centre of Copenhagen, but he would look outside his window as well on various different places that he lived. So notice the high viewpoint of this image here of these very stylized trees, again sentinels against that dark landscape. And this is what I mean about looking out of windows. This is winter landscape view of Christiansborg Palace of 1892. Everything is foggy and silent in a Hammershøi painting. There's no figures here in either the room or amongst the trees. There's a stillness in all of his paintings. He's often described as the Danish Vermeer. And after we had an exhibition of his paintings at the Royal Academy a few years ago, he became something of a vogue. The same theme is picked up here, looking out of a window, by Peder Severin Krøyer. We saw right at the beginning, painting at Skagen. He was very much a summer painter at Skagen, but here as early as 1871, he's looking out over the snowy rooftops of Copenhagen. Believe it or not, this painting can now be found in the Los Angeles County Museum, LA. And that also is worth thinking about in terms of who bought these paintings. Many were bought by Scandinavian self-made men who had settled in America. So the diaspora, the idea of leaving the homeland to find fame and fortune in America, means that many of these paintings actually found homes in American collections. So anyway, snowy rooftops here across Copenhagen. And we don't really think of Krøyer as painting snow. He's very much painting the sun and sand of Skagen. But I love this image of Hornbæk in winter. Just this is a seaside resort just north of Copenhagen. I'm not quite sure what all the poles are for. In terms, they're usually for telling you how deep the snow is. But I love the impasto way in which the snow in the foreground is painted thick, creamy paint. And again, that the sort of shadows, the purple shadows, are created by these rows of poles, obviously there for a purpose. Now, Jens Williamson is a completely different type of Danish artist, because he too, like Gerhard Munter, diversified into the world of design or decorative arts. This is as late as 1906. And you can see here what I mean about the influence of graphics. I love the way the trees are cropped, that strong sort of black and white patterning, very much influenced by book illustration. He was initially tutored by Krøyer, that's my link, but he, like many of the artists that we're looking at tonight, trained in Paris. So sojourns, as you can see, 1888 to 90, 93 to 94, and then 1903 to 1904. This is a typical pattern for the end of the 19th century, with artists toing and throwing to Paris as they wanted to learn within what's known as the atelier system, which was very different to an academic training, as you were allowed access to the life class from the very beginning of your training as an artist. This is my favourite painting by Jens Williamson. It's actually painted in Norway, because obviously, as you probably gathered, Denmark does not have paintings like this. So Jotunheimen is actually a scene in Norway, Norway's highest and most dramatic peaks. It's a really strange painting, because as you can see, it's not attempting to be naturalistic in any way. I wouldn't even say it's trying to create a sort of musicality or mystic quality. It's really almost like patterning. You've got all the reflections of the rocks in the water and in the snow, and we know that in fact his idea was to try and create the idea that you were looking at shapes in the snow. He was very influenced by Native American ideas that you would get a spirit animal in the snow. So here another example, patches of mist and snow. You can now make out a bird on the right hand side. There appears to be a dog running down the middle of the mountain. There appears to be a profile with an eye and a nose, perhaps of a troll. And then there's another dog or something similar, bottom left hand side. So the idea was here is you're looking at mythic shapes in the snow itself. Even more mythic is the amazing frame, which is painted zinc, cut out like a stencil and then painted. Again, it has a primitive quality to it. Appears to be a sort of Adam and Eve theme, perhaps. We've got male figures on the left-hand side, perhaps representing the ages of man, as there are different ages represented from youth to old age. I love the woman on the right-hand side who's bared her breasts. Again, there appears to have a sort of pagan consciousness here. Again, perhaps this idea of the antiquity of the land itself. And equally impressive is the way that he's delineated the mountains along the top of the frame. Again, this technique is painted zinc. So it's been enameled to create a three-dimensional row of mountains along the top of the frame. This is such a good example of the way in which Art Nouveau art breaks out of the frame. This is very much an Art Nouveau work. It was shown at Paris 1900, and yet Williamson was awarded a gold medal for his efforts. And I think you can see why. It really is a unique painting. And much could be said of the approach of Axel Gallen-Kallela, who around about 1905 will change his name from the Swedish form to the Finnish form, because again, this is all about identity. So you can see his original Swedish name, Axel Valdemar, so it will become Axel Gallen-Kallela, a reference to the Kalevala, which was how he channeled his particular interest in Finnish identity. Just as in the case of Norway, this is all about asserting your independence and identity through art. Because remember, until 1917, we're looking here at an imperial Russian duchy. He was obviously a very good-looking character, as you can see from the etching. He was also very fit. He was not an aesthete, but quite the opposite, very robust, very manly man, if I could put it that way. Here he is cross-country skiing. And that relates to my image of the lair of the lynx. He'd been suffering from ill health. He'd been in Italy, again, traveling with his wife, and he contracts malaria. He's very ill indeed. Comes back to Finland, decides that he needs to build up his strength, and goes lynx hunting with some friends. I'm pleased to report that no lynx died in the making of this painting. There's a whole sequence of the lair of the lynx, but we know from his diary and letters that this helped him to recover his health. I don't think anybody paints snow any better than Gallen-Kallela. And this is a massive canvas because it's part of a fresco sequence representing the 4 seasons. This is winter. I love the way the boughs bend under the weight of the snow, famous pine trees. And this is the sequence to which it belongs. It probably isn't a wise idea to engage in fresco painting in Finland. This is the Julius Mausoleum in Portray. It was to memorialize the premature death of the 11-year-old daughter of the patron, an industrialist. And the idea was that the individual panels represented Finnish life, the Kalevala, this famous mythic folk epic, and also the different seasons of the year. He has an ability to really capture, well, the weight of snow. So on the boughs of this tree again here, the way in which the boughs are bent under the weight of the snow, the lone pine tree, which seems to become again an anthropomorphized form. Imatra is the area, the spate here of the river. Obviously the ice is melting and creating this torrent, dating to 1893, and you'll find it in the Athenaeum collection in Helsinki. The study for it is even, I think, more effective in the sense that you really feel a tumultuous sense here. The land, the tree, the water, the snow all seem to have joined into one tumultuous sense of movement, which is fabulously expressed as well in the final painting. From the 1890s, you can see that his style will evolve into something more linear, more graphic. He will be another inveterate traveller. Already mentioned his trip to Italy. He'll even settle briefly in Africa, looking to rejuvenate his vision. But what really kept his vision alive was in 1894 building a studio in the wilderness. He named it Kallela after the Kalevala, this folk mythology that he uses throughout his career to express the Finnish identity. We're on Lake Ruovesi, a really remote spot here, skaters on the ice of 1896. He's painting alongside here Albert Eidelfelt, who was his mentor. He learnt to paint with the aid of this artist, who again largely spent his life painting in and around Paris. So that's Albert Eidelfelt. So here is Kallela on a winter night. That's the name of the painting. But we've also got a photograph of what it looked like. It was built in the Karelian style. Again, this was all part of Gallen-Kallella's attempt to assert his Finnish identity. The area, Karelian area, is right in the north of Finland, sweeps around today to take up parts of Russia. Karelia was seen to be the Finnish homeland. Here, their culture was said to have been preserved, uncorrupted by outside foreign influences. So you can see he's built a house here in the Karelian style to assert his identity. This will be his headquarters, and the inside has a rather homely feel to it, thanks to his interest in the English arts and crafts movement. The beautiful rug, often known as the fire rug, was designed by Gallen-Kallela. Again, he moves under the influence of William Morris into the world of art and craft. And he's perhaps best known, you can see just on the right-hand side, one of his designs depicting one of the big scenes, the defense of the Sampo. It's a really important scene from the story of the Kalevala, for which today he is best known. But I love these landscapes. They have a magical quality to them. That idea of capturing spontaneous movement and light has now become pattern, as you can see, with those purple shadows in the foreground. The influence of the Japanese print seen in that lone pine, again dramatically cropped at top and bottom, and that vast expanse of ice over the lake itself, Ruovesi. Here the ice is breaking up and melting, again creating something of an optical pattern, looking towards the island in the centre of the lake. That's from 1917, and the painting on the right-hand side, although still showing the influence of the Japanese print, particularly cropping at the top, is about 10 years earlier. So these two very similar themes are showing you how his artistic style is developing into something actually, as you can see, much more abstract, more about pattern making. He'll take you through all the seasons of the year. 1908 here, rather dark and foreboding painting on the edge of the lake, to these wonderful images from this is this campaign in pursuit of lynx of 1906, with that wonderful blue sky above. And you can see that the sketch, particularly of 1906, has a spontaneous quality to it, whereas Snow on the Cliffs, painted at Kallela of 1901, is clearly being finished in the studio, was just the sort of painting that was commercially successful. The high viewpoint is very interesting again, shows the influence of photography and the Japanese print. So you can see again here the difference between the immediate sketch and the more finished final work. I love the way he paints snow. So the layer of the lynx on the left-hand side, 1908, is just the pattern of the snow and the rocks. And 1906, you do get some intimation of that elusive lynx, just his paw prints in the snow. Otherwise, it's more like a snow sculpture, as you can see. And here's another one from the same campaign of 1906. So it interests me, the psychology of how an artist will light on a particular motif and then keep coming back and painting it again until perhaps they feel that they've got the quintessential image that they are looking for. And that is particularly true if you know his beautiful white lake, of which there are at least half a dozen versions in our National Gallery in London. It's in fact, one of the gallery's most popular paintings. So we're now in Sweden, and another artist who was really good at painting snow. He uses a somewhat different technique, perhaps influenced by French pointillism. This is Gustaf Fjaestad. That J is a Y, Fjaestad. And he is part of an artistic commune, and as you're about to discover, his wife was equally talented. But this, painted in the 1890s, when I saw it in the National Gallery in Stockholm, looked almost like a tapestry, because those little tiny individual pointillist points of paint looked almost like stitches in a canvas. Again, he's able to really capture the weight of the snow on the boughs of the fir trees. And he had a thing about fir trees. Like Gallen-Kallela, Gerhard Munter and Williamson, he's going to move sideways into the decorative arts, and he's most famous for his furniture, which was actually carved for him by a team of skilled craftsmen. But the theme, as you can see, is the fir trees. We have fronds, we have cones, and the arms, the boughs of the tree, take on an almost skeletal quality in the Stabber chair of 1894. Believe it or not, these were popular. Here's a whole set of them in the Teals, or this is the Teelska Museum in Stockholm. This is a wonderful collection put together by the industrious Teals, and he has, not only has he got a complete set of furniture on this theme, some arts and crafts, this has got an amusing backstory to it. Teals saw an amazing set of furniture by Henri van der Velde when he went to visit the Nietzsche Library in Weimar. So he asked Fjaestad to produce something like the furniture by van der Velde, but in a specifically Swedish idiom. This is what he got. So again, sort of rough-hewn logs, particularly the way the legs of the table are sculptured. You can also see that Teals collected works by Edvard Munch. They are on the wall in the background, including, just out of view, a portrait of Nietzsche. And here, again, believe it or not, another set of this remarkable furniture, which recently went through the sale room. Again, if you're thinking of an unusual Christmas dinner, this would certainly provide it in terms of the tub chairs and that remarkable table. This time it was acquired by a tobacco producer, Erland Olsen, for his home, his country retreat at Arvika. Well, it takes all sorts, doesn't it? But I think you'll agree they are pretty unique. So back to his paintings, because again, using this pointillist technique that he has derived from looking at paintings by Seurat, Seignac, and possibly Pizarro, he has developed this very precise way of painting snow, this one of 1900. Or here, the contrast between the snow and the water. You've got an area here, that very still mill pond reflective surface, but you can see the ice around that abstract shape. And he was very good. This one dates to 1908. Very good at sort of creating that contrast between the frozen land and the either moving or very still water. So I love this. Lives in the National Gallery in Copenhagen. The cold air seems to be coming towards you, blown over the water till it hits, looks almost like coral, where the branches are so totally covered in frost. So it has a sort of aquatic underwater feel to it. It's also a very big painting, by the way, monumental. Frozen lake here, look at the patterning of the crystals on the ice. It's almost like ice cubes, doesn't it? Scattered across. And again, you almost feel like you're looking at branches that have turned into stone. If you're into Narnia, you'll know what I mean. Again, there's a wonderful contrast here between the snow and the shape of the landscape, making a pattern, rather like the painting that I showed you by Fritz Tallau. The wonderful abstract shape of the land, the untrammeled snow, and then the ice, again like ice cubes scattered over the icy surface, and the trees that are so coated with ice that they look like they've been turned to stone. There's like a real frozen feel to this. This is Lake Racken, and we're in Värmland. And within the Teelska Gallery in Stockholm. And here it's actually now melting, so the water is moving and reflecting, but it still has this amazing frozen quality to it. The contrast between the water, creating all those amazing patterns, and then the frozen land to either side. And here, this is a motif again that really appealed to him. So you can see here these images are numbered. This is number 4 of Rimfrost. Here, this water is now running. This is 1906. By this stage, he is part of this artist colony the Rakan colony of artists in Arvika in Värmland, where he settles with his wife from 1897. So that's the painting, and that inspires this wonderful tapestry. In 1898, he marries the artist Maja Hallen. She was the weaver of the tapestry, so she helps to make this conversion of the painted image into this woven one. But she was also a potter, also was a painter in her own right. So it's a really interesting husband and wife collaboration. You can see how big this tapestry is from the case on the right-hand side. Harald Solberg was also much more interested in the spirit of the place rather than trying to make an accurate depiction. So he's not approaching it the way that Monet was in the 1870s, looking at his paintings of Argenteuil. In the case of Harald Solberg, it was very much the image of Rodanthe, famous mountains in North Norway. So Winter Night Rodanthe is part of a whole series of paintings by Harald Solberg. They are painted between 1901 to 1914 and definitely fall into the elements of symbolism. They have a mystic quality to them. They're in different shades of blue, as you can see. There's no naturalism here. There's these sentinel-like trees in the foreground. There's one version with a fox in the foreground, but for the most part, they are devoid of any life at all, human or animal. He's a really interesting artist. He leads a very isolated life, painting Røros, which is an interesting town in that it is not a rural idyll. It was a mining town. So Solberg was interested in difficult spaces. You're in the far north, you're in a wilderness, but here you've got a town whose existence relies on exploitation, in this case, coal mining. It's an equally hard life, whether you're working the land or extracting its mineral riches. So this is Røros, and here it is covered in snow in 1901. I love all the ochre-coloured and red houses that are so distinctly Norwegian. Ochre always said to be a middle-class colour, and red always allegedly a working-class colour, but most importantly, very much Norwegian colours. The white houses are the most expensive because white paint, red paint, is the most expensive. But I just look at the way the snow is piled up against these houses. But it's really the concept of winter night at Rodanthe. So there's a whole sequence of this. This is another one. He first discovers the motif on a skiing trip in 1899. But what you really need to focus on when you see these paintings is their mystic quality. They have a spirituality to them. This is not about painting quickly on the spot. And if you look carefully, not only do you have the star in the middle of the landscape, when we get closer up, you can see that the very pinnacle of the mountain is inscribed with a crucifixion, imbuing the landscape with a spiritual quality, which is also, of course, indicated by the shining star. They are beautiful images and have a haunting quality. So I'm going to end with this idea of moving away from painting quickly out of doors to the whole idea of the spiritual quality of snow and mountains with the work of the Canadian artist known as the Group of Seven. Don't worry, I won't do all seven. I'm just going to pick, in fact, on one who is my favourite, who is Lauren, with a W, Harris. So this is Lake and Mountains of 1928. Highly stylised. It could almost be a poster with its strong delineation, and you might even call it Art Deco in terms of its styling. So here's Lauren Harris. He doesn't die until 1970, which is remarkable when you think about it, in terms of his proximity to us in time. He was the unofficial leader of the group of 7. They coalesced officially in 1920, immediately after the First World War. Several of them were involved as war artists. And really, as artists, they've been practicing since the opening years of the 20th century. But he will definitely emerge as the leader. This is Winter Woods of 1915. So he's only 20 when he paints this. And in the foreground, we have these very distinctive trees laden with snow, which are likely to be jack pines. These are perceived to be national emblems of Canada. And the most famous version, I love this close-up showing you how beautifully it's painted with this thick impasto style. Also, that's how the pine tree has got weighted down by the snow. But I think it's one of these. Here is the jack pine of 1917, painted by Tom Thomson. Thomson is said to be the sort of founder father of the group of 7, but he dies mysteriously in 1917. We believe that he drowns on the rather aptly named Lake Canoe, but we're not sure. His death is shrouded in mystery. It's given rise to all sorts of rather outlandish hypotheses. Some believe that he rather just disappeared. But this image, the jack pine, which you will find in the National Gallery in Ottawa, has become an iconic representation of the Canadian landscape, because they're doing just what all the other artists we've looked at this evening, whether you're in Denmark or Finland or Norway, they are all striving to paint a quintessential national image. You can perhaps see that there is a bit of snow in the mountains in the background, but the important thing is it's this theme of pine and also the way that Thomson paints. At this stage, he is painting in a very thick, creamy, painterly manner. These are all tiny paintings. They're little sketches on panel about the size of a large cigar box. They're all photographed by me when I went to the gallery in Toronto. And they are very powerful imagery indeed. Well, again, bringing out the sort of mystic quality of the landscape, that lone tree, its silhouettes against the sky, and how thick and creamy the paint is. Or here, Northern Spring of 1916. You can see what I mean about the influence of Vincent van Gogh, how thickly it is painted. And an unusual motif, because perhaps surprisingly very few artists tackle it, given how many paint in the far north, the Northern Lights, painted in the spring of 1917, the very year in which he will die. So these are all quite small sketches. But his technique had a profound effect on Laurens, with a W, Lauren S. Harris. Winter Afternoon, City Street in Toronto is pretty much, isn't it, a typical impressionist subject. Very ordinary, stroll along the streets, plopping along the bottom, beautiful shadows on the snow. It has a feeling of freshness and spontaneity. But Harris was always moving with the times. And by the post-First World War era, he had created a style that seems to borrow from Cubism, the angularity of it. But there's also almost a surrealist element here. These mountains take on a spiritual but also vaguely anthropomorphic quality. I love the way you get the echo, the pealing of the sky. So like you see how you've got the point of the peak at the top, and then it's like a rippling echo of blue in the sky. Very highly stylized. Mountain sketch, as you can see, numbered, was preparatory to this. Mountain in snowy, rocky mountain paintings, again, one of a series dating to 1929. The group of 7, and Harris in particular, were some of the first to paint these rugged landscapes, even going up to Baffin Island and into the Arctic to paint. They were some of the first artists to paint the Arctic. I mean, artists have gone up there on scientific expeditions, but this is the first time artists went in search of artistic motifs, like mountain in snow, rocky mountain paintings. Number 7. I love them. but they are really highly stylized, have a graphic quality to them. Arctic peaks, North Shore, Baffin Island. Baffin Islands, I think I was reading it was the 5th largest island in the world, right at the north of mainland Canada. You could not get more isolated if you tried. Reminds me of the trips that I took on Spirit of Adventure that took me right up to Svalbard and above the Arctic Circle. The sort of quiet majesty of these landscapes. So here, Baffin Island, North Shore, again that stylized peak. And here, Baffin Island Mountains of 1931. Again, there's a contrast between the sky, that wonderful echo effect, the craggy mountains, and then the wonderful mirror-like water in the foreground. They look to me very much like posters that I associate with Art Deco styling. And but I think they are majestic and have a sort of bring a mystical quality to the northern landscape. So therefore I'm leaving you with this one, which is purely a blend of different mountains that he has seen. Mountain landscape of 1927 to 28, where you feel that they've moved way away from this idea of capturing very quickly a spontaneous image of the landscape to something imbued with poetry and with a spirituality. I love the way the light, like a cone of light, almost the hand of God, is shining over the mountain. So this idea of nature uncontaminated by human presence, its majesty, its awe, and the idea again of a landscape unspoilt by humans, a majesty in the mountains. So I'll leave you with my last slide, because whenever they have a poll in Norway as to what is their favourite artist, or I should say what is their favourite painting, the one by Harald Solberg of The Winter Night in Rodanthe usually comes out on top. Here it is in its sequence. Again, I'm fascinated by the way in which an artist will constantly revisit a motif that really seems to have fired his imagination. And he will carry on painting it until he feels, hopefully, that he has achieved his ideal image. So Solberg's Winter Night in Rodanthe is usually voted Norway's most popular image.